Okay. On to our penultimate, our second to last question for these brief videos, what has become 2 brief videos. Another question we examined in our discussion board. Why are we learning about discourse communities so early in the term in this college writing course? I think Melzer helps us understand it well, and many of us selected this quotation or parts of it in our discussion board posts. Melzer writes, he comes out and says it really explicitly. Understanding what a discourse community is and the ways that certain genres perform social actions in discourse communities can help you better understand where your college teachers are coming from in their writing assignments, and also help you understand why there are different writing expectations and genres for different classes in different fields. If you've ever wondered why a good paper in an English class or a writing class, why something that you would do in a literature paper would be praised in that class, and then if you were to do that same thing in a scientific paper, why that you would get negative feedback from an instructor, this is the reason. As students, and especially as undergraduate students, every different course you go to, if you go from writing to biology to criminal justice class, you are hopping between all of these discourse communities, and these discourse communities have their own sets of expectations, of writing expectations. We could talk about more general expectations, ways of being more general discourse things, but let's just focus on writing. All of these discourse communities have their own expectations for how genres, what genres we choose, how we conform to those genres. So, for example, in the humanities, in classes like this, or in literature, it's really encouraged, it's really common for you to quote heavily. I think we place a lot of value on language, so we really expect you to bring that language exactly into your paper. Quoting is much less common in scientific fields. They want to see the results. They want to see the data. They don't care how elegantly it's phrased. They want you to accurately summarize a concept and move on. So if you've ever experienced that sort of disconnect between writing classes, this explains it. There is no one good way to write. There is only the learned ways to write well within a discourse community. So that might help explain that phenomenon that you have probably encountered and maybe are encountering right now as an undergraduate student. Of course, that will cease, right? That will, as you specialize in, say, criminal justice, you'll slowly intuit, you'll slowly learn the conventions of and the genres and the writing expectations, and even the way that you're expected to think and the language you're expected to use as a criminal justice major. The problem, and why we are focused on this concept of a discourse community in a college level writing course, is because it serves everyone. We could, I suppose, put on a how to write in a criminal justice course, but that wouldn't serve those of you who are majoring in music very well, would it? But beyond that, the thing to remember here is, so you might ask yourself, okay, well, why is it important for us to know these ideas about discourse communities? And the answer is, you are going to be expected to be able to perform and assume these discourses and perform in these discourse communities. And it's possible your teachers aren't explicitly going to tell you how to do so. Melzer, I think, is really right when he writes that, unfortunately, Teachers are so used to the conventions of their discourse communities that they sometimes don't explain to students the reasons behind the writing conventions of their discourse communities. If you ever got, feedback on a paper and it's just a red X through a quote and it says "don't quote," you might ask yourself why. Your teacher isn't explaining to you that quotation isn't particularly valued in a chemistry paper. And in fact, your teacher has been writing in that discourse community for so long that he or she doesn't even know it themselves. It seems transparent, but it isn't, right? So we are teaching you to study discourse communities because in the university and beyond, you very well may find yourself on your own. You very well may find yourself having to inhabit, having to intuit, and having to perform the expectations, especially the written expectations, but there are many other expectations of your discourse community yourself. So the tools we're giving you here are such that you can find, understand, and conform to what equals successful writing in your discipline, if you want to choose that as your discourse community. Because as we know, maybe if I haven't made it explicit yet, I should make it explicit now. Discourse communities are all about inclusion or exclusion. If you, if I walked into a room of my peers, of other writing instructors, and I was using ain't a lot, which sometimes I do when I'm talking to my family, when I'm assuming my family discourse community, because I'm from Missouri. But if I walked into a room of my peers and I said ain't, it's possible that many of them would not consider me a part of that discourse community because I'm using non-standard English. Exactly the same situation here. These are the stakes for you all as you strive to enter the discourse community that is your discipline, your major, and beyond, of course. Every job you've ever had or will have is its own little discourse community. So instead of, what's the phrase? Instead of giving you a fish in this course, focusing on discourse communities, we are teaching you to fish. You can take these ideas, and you yourself can then discover the expectations of any discourse community that might be placed upon you. Great. That was all review. I think you all answered that last question really well in the discussion board. This is a little bit of a bridge into next week. I want to just talk a little bit. I heard from some of you that the Swales reading was particularly difficult. I wholeheartedly agree. Why, perhaps, was the Swales article difficult? To answer that question, we'll take a quick look at this notion of the rhetorical situation. In brief, all texts have a writer, they have an audience. Sometimes that we might say writer and audience, we might say author and reader, we might even say speaker and listener, but all texts have a writer, an audience, and a subject, right? They're about something. Texts are created by someone, the writer, for someone, the audience, and about something, the subject. That's what we can say about every piece of communication in the entire world. We'll see that this gets a little bit more complicated. There are ideas of exigence, purpose, and genre, but we'll save that for next week. For right now, why was the Swales piece perhaps more difficult to read? The answer is because he's writing for other linguists. The audience, he is writing to explain this idea of a discourse community to other specialized scholars. As a result, the genre feels more like a published academic piece in a linguistics journal. In fact, we know that's what it was. Now, how might we use the rhetorical situation to explain how the Melzer piece maybe felt a little different? What perhaps to you seems different about the Melzer piece? The writer's different. The subject's the same. We're still talking about discourse communities. But the writer's different. And what I can tell using my own rhetorical ability is that the audience is very different for this text. It's really clear to me that Melzer is not writing to other experts, to other linguists. He's writing to students, right? So that one little node in the triangle changes. Sure, the writer changes, but Melzer in his own right is a respected academic. So I think what really has changed here is the audience. He's writing to students. As a result, things shift. The purpose shifts just a little bit, right? He's writing less to be as abstruse as possible, and he's using more accessible language because he's writing to really help you understand what he knows is a pretty complicated idea. So we could say that the purpose goes from maybe proving a theory, which I think is what Swales is doing, to informing, really giving examples, really being educational. Right, so just because that audience bit has changed, the purpose changes a little bit. The genre, I'll venture to say, has changed a little bit. This reads, the Melzer piece reads much more like a textbook chapter than an academic article. And I could point to all the reasons why, but I think we've maybe intuited them. This is all to say that I know that the Swales reading was hard. I'm very aware of that. And it's a goal of this course as we seek to professionalize, to enter discourse communities where we can participate not just as students, but as equals. We will begin to look at what writing between peers, between high-level regarded peers looks like. So we will be venturing into some of these difficult writings, but just I know they're difficult, and that's why we're going to spend so much time discussing them in the discussion board. Finally, to link this to what happens in week 2, the final point I want to make is that what we're seeing with that Swales piece is what it looks like when scholars use research and write as a conversation. Swales wrote that piece for a reason. He cites evidence that came before. After that piece was written, many people, including Melzer himself, responds to what he has said, right? So these two readings are also a pretty good example of what it looks like for scholars to not just write an idea and publish it in silence, but to write it in this context of other voices that have come before, and ultimately, after it's published, voices that will respond to it later.